2 or 3 weeks ago I did a video which was a test that I conducted, a controlled test of how increasingly high ISO affected noise in the image. And I also did a little bit of playing around with some denoise software to see how well it worked. But given what ISO actually does, there's an alternative, and that is to accept an underexposed image at a lower ISO and then brighten that image in post-processing using something like the exposure slider in Lightroom. So the question is, which works best? Is it better to shoot a properly exposed image at high ISO, or reduce the ISO and then brighten that image up later? Well, I'm not 100% sure, so I decided to have a little test and I thought I'd share it with you. I hope you'll enjoy the video. If you do and you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me, and let's start off with just talking a little bit about high ISO and what ISO actually does. I'm not going to get into too much that's technical. We often refer to ISO as the third leg of, or the third side of the exposure triangle, along with exposure time or shutter speed and aperture. But ISO is different to the other two. Both shutter speed and aperture actually change the amount of light that's reaching the sensor. But ISO doesn't. What it actually does is amplifies the effect of the light on the sensor. And that's where this idea of high ISO noise comes from. It's basically a signal to noise ratio issue, which means that you get this graininess, this color patterning in the images. Noise exists in every single image, but it's whether it's visible or not and to what extent it's there that makes the difference. And then let's consider the reason for shooting at a high ISO. And for me, that's because I need to shoot at a faster exposure time, a faster shutter speed than I can do with a low ISO in the light conditions that I've got. So I might bump the ISO up to 6400 or even higher in order to get a good exposure, an exposure that looks good as a histogram and looks bright enough on camera. But what about that other option, shooting with a lower ISO and then bringing that into something like Lightroom as a raw file and using the exposure slider to bump it up? Does that produce a better result, a worse result, or is it about the same? I wasn't really 100% sure, so I decided to test it. So what I did is I set up a little test using my 8-25 lens standing on a piece of white paper on top of my printer, and I took a number of images with my OM1 Mark II and the 12-100 lens. As a base image, I decided to shoot an exposure that looked good. No blown highlights, no clipped shadows, and bright enough to be usable. And I shot that at ISO 12,800. What I then did was I progressively reduced the ISO a stop at a time, with leaving all of the other settings the same. So I did one stop down, ISO 6400, and then 2 stops down, ISO 3200, 3 stops, ISO 1600, and 4 stops, ISO 800. So what I've got is progressively darker and darker images that I can then play with in Lightroom. And that's what we're going to do now. Okay, so here are my images in Lightroom. They've had absolutely nothing done to them. No changes to exposure, no sharpening, no noise reduction. The only thing I've done is allowed the lens correction to run, which I do on all of my imports. So this is the first image. This is the ISO 12,800, and it looks absolutely fine as a normal view. I can just about make out there's a little bit of noise in there. Obviously looking at the other images isn't very realistic because they're just getting darker and darker as we go through. Quick look at this 12,800 ISO image at 100%, and you can just about see some noise particularly in the lettering here and around, you know, some of like the shiny surfaces. But in order to do a proper comparison, what we have to now do is brighten all of those other images up to be the same level as the 12,800 image. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the ISO 6400 image, and we're going to use the exposure adjustment and increase that by 1. We're going to go into the 3200 image, increase the exposure 2 stops. The 1600 image and the exposure goes up 3 stops, and the 800 image and the exposure goes up 4 stops. So now I've got all of my images looking about the same, the exposure looks about the same, and looking at them at this size, there doesn't appear to be a tremendous amount of difference between the images, the exception being the ISO 800 one does look a bit noisier. But then let's look at 100%, shall we? So this is the 12,800 image, and as I said, a little bit of noise apparent around some of these areas here, but in general it's not too bad, and I wouldn't worry about that level of noise in an image pre any denoising. Let's have a look at the 6400 image. So 12,800, 6400, doesn't really look any different as far as I can see. And then the 3200, I mean, the noise may be slightly worse in some areas on the 3200 image, but then it's slightly better in others. So it kind of looks like the noise is a bit different, but I'd struggle to say if it was better or worse. ISO 1600, and again the same, looks slightly worse in some places and slightly better in others. So again, I'd struggle to say whether it was better or worse. And then let's go to ISO 800. Now interestingly, ISO 800 has had the biggest adjustment in Lightroom. We've gone 4 stops, and I would say that is noticeably worse than all of the others. Whereas the others look slightly different, but no better or worse, just slightly different, the ISO 800 one looks noticeably worse. So there seems to be a break-off point there at around 3, somewhere between 3 and 4 stops, when brightening in post gets worse than brightening using high ISO. Okay, but what about doing some noise reduction? Well, what I'm going to do is run all of them through Topaz Denoise AI. And normally when I do this, I would look at, you know, exactly what settings look best for each individual image. But in this case, what I'm going to do is just run them through all exactly the same. I'm just going to use the kind of default settings and just see what it does. Okay, so here are my denoised images. You can see they're TIFF files now because they've been through an external edit. So this is 12,800 and it looks nice and clean. 6400, and at this size view I can't see any difference. 3200, and again normal view I can't see any difference. 1600, and again normal view I can't really see any difference. 800, if I'm being picky, I think the ISO 800 one is just starting to show some noise creeping back in, particularly in around the upside down 8 to 25 here. I can see some sort of colour noise going on. Let's go back to the 12,800 and let's go into 100%. And I think that looks okay. After the denoising, 6400, no particularly noticeable difference. Again, maybe a slight difference in the way the colouring looks, but not too drastic. This one's 3200 after denoising, and again, it would be very difficult for me to choose between these ones. Oop. ISO 1600. Yeah. Again, can't really see a lot of difference. And the ISO 800. Okay, so again, ISO 800, and this is the one where it was 4 stops underexposed. I had to increase the exposure by 4 stops. And there I can see noise creeping back into the lettering again. So this would have needed more denoise applying than the other images. So there you have it. In this test at least, it would appear that there is no difference between shooting a correctly exposed image at a high ISO and shooting a underexposed image at a lower ISO up to about 3 stops of light underexposed, and then it starts to make a difference to the end quality of the image. Interesting to know, and will maybe make me think a little bit about my ISO settings when I'm out shooting next time. What about you? Do you shoot high ISO, or do you correct in post? Or maybe this video will inspire you to go and do your own tests and see what you think. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give it a like. Don't forget about leaving me a comment. And if you're new here and you've enjoyed this and you want to see more of my photography and other videos, then don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. As always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch, so thank you very much. And until next week, bye.